Welcome to the webinar Language Instruction Educational Programs. This webinar will provide you with information regarding the effective implementation of a language instruction educational program for English language learners. The Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015 provided us with new legislation to implement these programs and also to create a level of not only effective programs but also to measure their effectiveness with English learners. ESA has provided us with new terminology that I will explain here because it is very important for all of us educators understand the new terms. Language Instruction Educational Program LIEP replaces what we used to have as ESL programs. The same way for English language development. ELD is actually the language component of the Language Instruction Educational Program. So that is the previously known ESL instruction by the ESL teacher. There is a new reclassification criteria, which is something that we are going to address in future slides. The WIDA screener is the assessment that we use to find the level of English language proficiency of our students. The new term for English learners is ELS, and that replaces English language learners. We also are referring to children who are English language learners in early childhood as dual language learners, DLLs. There is a component now in the program that allows parents to opt out. It's a waiver to opt out of the ELD instruction of the Language Instruction Educational Program. I will be explaining that later. Access for ELs continues to be the assessment, the yearly assessment, state mandated, that usually in Pennsylvania it's implemented in the spring, in the months of February and March. We also have our English language development standards for English learners that you can find in our website at the Department of Education or at the SAS webpage. The new English Learners Reporting System, ELRS, is also a new feature from ESA, and that is something that is a report that all administrators need to be aware of to collect data to inform the state about the effectiveness of their programs, and most of all to see if their programs are aligning to the new requirements of the law. We also have now to report on students with limited or interrupted formal education, SLIFE. These students are students who usually have had some event in their academic lives that have stopped them from attending formal schooling. So usually refugee students or students who come from countries where they have been working for some time due to poverty, and now they come back to school. So that is why it's so important to understand that now we are collecting this data, the number of students that are SLIFE. We are also collecting data on long-term English learners. Long-term English learners are students who stay in the English language educational program or language instruction educational program for more than 5 years. So we are collecting data on these students also. We are also going to present you with the Future Ready PA Index for the EL indicators. So all of these terms are very important for you to understand that in your program you will have to actually use many of these terms, and also you will have to report on very specific data. During this webinar, we are going to examine federal and state requirements regarding the education of English learners. We're also going to identify tools and principles related to instruction and assessment of English learners in a language instruction educational program. So we're going to provide you with the federal and state background to develop a program that is aligned to the requirements of ESSA, but we are also going to talk about instruction and assessment and what that involves as it relates to the development of your program. We need to start from the very beginning, as we always say. So with that, we need to understand that in Pennsylvania, we are really using the multi-tier system of supports model to provide a safety net to all students to be able to achieve the standards that are required for our students to achieve. So in MTSS, we have two sides of this pyramid. One side is the academic system, which is a tiered system. We have 3 tiers in which we provide the supports necessary for these children to actually achieve, for all children. The question is always, so where is the English language development instruction when you are implementing a multi-tier system of support? And here on the bottom, you see that it is in tier 1. Tier 1 actually looks at all the content instruction that all children need to have. ELD instruction in Pennsylvania is content instruction, delivered by a teacher with an ESL program specialist certificate. So that is key to understand the importance of implementing a program with teachers who are qualified to teach English learners. On the behavioral side, we have also the idea of, so how do we really deal with children who are new to our school system? There is a process of acculturation in the area of behavior that we need to consider for English learners. And that is, maybe one of the crucial issues why many ELs in some school systems or programs are actually cited for behavior issues. So the acculturation process needs to be acknowledged by psychologists and counselors in order to create proactive ways to deal with these children. There's also the component of family and community engagement that requires by law that we not only welcome these families but provide also the bridge for these families to be able to understand our system in their preferred language, or the language that they are more dominant on. And that is important because we as a system need to provide translators and interpreters, not just any translator or interpreter, but qualified translators and interpreters. We will deal with that in depth in the webinar. The Pennsylvania Department of Education has a basic educational circular. On the left of your screen, you have the address where you can find this BEC, Basic Educational Circular. In the slides here, I provide you with some of the most important features of this basic educational circular. So there is a definition of English language development. There is, why do we need to have that? There's also the identification procedures for pre-K and then K-12 students. It also talks about the home language survey. There's guidance for the evaluation of foreign transcripts. There is also an area that talks about special populations, and that is something new that is addressed in the BEC, which is foreign exchange students, and also guidelines for English learners with individualized educational plans, IEPs. There's also guidance for parents' right to refuse the LIEP and all associated documents and forms. That is new with ESSA the waiver form or the ways that we need to deal with parents who refuse services or who refuse ELD instruction is delineated here. So we are going to provide you with some of that information, but my advice is that you go directly into the source. If you look at these slides, or they are actually uh, live areas here. So you can click and you will be able to access these places. There's also the reclassification, monitoring, and redesignation of EL's document. There is guidance for Title III for LEAs. And then there is also guidance for how these new changes are translated into PIMS and other procedures. um, what area or what kind of information do we really want parents to understand in regards to the opt-out possibility that they have? Actually, the opt-out needs to be explained thoroughly to these parents in their first language. So the only thing that, or the only area that these students will not receive direct instruction will be in the ELD or in the area of language development. Everything else they will be getting, like for example, accommodations in the content areas or in their classrooms. They are also going to be assessed every year with access for ELLs. And we are still responsible for supporting this child at achieving every standard that all children are expected to achieve. So the opt-out actually is for the ELD component of the program. This really explains it very well. For example, yes, they can opt out of Title III supplemental services, like for example, after school programs. They can say, I don't want my child to participate in an after school program. They can actually opt out from the bilingual program or the English language development program. But all of these accommodations that are necessary for the students to learn have to be in place, and also the assessment at the end of the school year, in which you're going to find out what level of English language proficiency the student is. In the back, there is an area that talks about identification and placement of English learners. And this is very important because the Basic Educational Circular now has live components. That means that if you click on the blue areas, if you download the document and you click in the blue areas, it will take you immediately and provide you more information about that. It is important to understand that in the Basic Educational Circular, you're also going to have more or find more information regarding the English language development component of your program. Okay, so there's not specific times given for that instruction. It is according to the level of English language proficiency of the student. The lower the level of English language proficiency of the student, the more time they need to have with the ESL teacher. The higher the level, the less time with the ESL teacher. Okay? And then again, the responsibility of the education of English learners is of all teachers that this student has. It's not just the ESL teacher. And that is also very important to share with everybody. Grading is very important for these children and for all children in general, but there is some guidance about grading. And some things about also transcripts are specified here. So it says there that Yale information should not appear on a high school transcript unless it is part of a course title, but it may be contained on a report card or progress report. So that's important to know. We have a core ELD program requirements chart that we have place that together with this webinar. So my advice to you, since this cannot be really, it's not easy to read, but I will go over every component of this chart. My advice is for you to download the chart, and as I am presenting it, maybe you can actually take a look at the chart and know what, what are, for example, the requirements or the legal references, because what I will be doing is looking at the program piece. Okay, so why is it important that we follow these requirements? To begin with, the requirements really are federal requirements and state requirements. In the middle, you have the legal references. That means that, what that means is that if districts or any other LEAs, like charter schools, or even specific programs for children who are English learners, do not follow these requirements, there are legal implications. And if parents want to sue the district or the charter school, lawyers will look at these legal references in order to make up their cases. That is why it's so important that we understand the why we need to do things in a certain way. For identification of English learners, the most important piece here is the home language survey. The home language survey is a 3 to 4 questions that are given to parents at the time of registration. And they have to fill out this form that could come in multiple languages or with an interpreter, in which parents are going to provide information about what was the first language that the child learned, and if there is another language spoken at home, and if the child actually communicates in that language. Okay, so if the answer to the questions is, yes, that really, triggers the next steps. There's also, we need to make sure that our staff has been trained, because home language surveys are given to all students. Since 1972, the Office for Civil Rights requires every district, every LEA, to implement a home language survey. It's actually part of, providing access to education to all children. So this is not just for ELs. This is the first step that is going to actually trigger the next step, which will be the assessment of the English language proficiency of the student. Trained staff is important because sometimes secretaries are the ones that help parents with their documentation at registration. So it is important that secretaries know about this. There's also a parent interview that is required now to find out a little bit more about the student and the language development of the student. So all of that is spelled out by the Pennsylvania Department of Education in their websites. The website that is focused on the education of English learners. You will see that later as I present. After we find out that the student actually speaks another language at home, or that's the first language that he learned, and at home that's the preferred language of communication, then appropriate proficiency test is implemented, which for kindergarten students is the WAPT, and for students in grades 1 to 12 is the WIDA screener. That is one part of the assessment that is going to tell me the English language proficiency of the student in the areas of listening, speaking, reading, and writing English. But there's also other criteria that I need to be looking into in order to place the student in the program or exempt the student from the program. So I need to really identify the home language proficiency, how proficient the student is in his home language, and if possible, find out the literacy skills that the student has in first language. That is a very, very important information. In some instances, there's also, a short test for math skills. You need to investigate the prior schooling experience. Why is that important? Because we, at that point, need to determine whether the student is a SLIFE. That means a student with limited or interrupted formal education. And that is data that now is required to be collected. So I need to know whether the student has had interrupted or limited formal education. After I identify the student, then I need to also ask questions about what happens if a student arrives with an IEP. What happens when student moves from one state to the other or one district to the other and has an IEP. Then you must coordinate with the special education staff in order to complete this procedure. If there is a referral, from the other district in regards to assessing of the student, or if there is, some strong evidence that the student will require an evaluation for to get an IEP, then you really need to work hand in hand with the special education personnel. We have some guidelines for learners with IEPs. There is an address on the bottom of this slide that I would advise you to go there to find out more information. So now that we have the student assessed and the decision has been made that he will require to enter the language instruction educational program, now I have to look at all the evidence and I have to develop the instructional plan for the student. And that is part of your instructional plan as you describe your language instruction educational program. In Pennsylvania, we could either, according to 4.26 of Chapter 4, we can have a language instruction educational program that focuses on ELD, English Language Development, prior known as ESL, or we can also have a bilingual program. So regardless of your instructional plan, you must have an English language development program with your model. Okay, so in Pennsylvania, we implement our ELD, English language development instruction as daily instruction. We need to schedule daily instruction, and that portion of the instruction has to be provided by a qualified teacher, which is a teacher with the ESL program specialist certificate. You also have to develop an assessment plan. How are you going to monitor progress? That's what the assessment plan is all about. You have to adopt a model that is evidence-based, that has been researched, and that is proved to be effective. You have to identify what are you going to teach during that English language development time, and that's your ELD curriculum. What materials are you going to be implementing, and also you're going to describe what other opportunities for language development the student may have. They could be also opportunities to interact with other students and opportunities to feel that they belong in their schools. Tutoring, after school programs, extracurricular activities, all of that is part of how are you actually implementing your program. Training is also a very important component of your language instruction educational program, and all the content teachers who have ELs in their classrooms have to be trained in how to teach English learners. So that's part of your yearly professional development plan. So when we look at the language instructional educational program as a pie, we look at this pie and we know that the LIEP is the whole pie. One part of the pie is the ELD instruction, which is the English language development instruction that is offered by or implemented by the ESL teacher. But all of the other times of the pie are, times when the student is in their elementary classroom or middle school classroom or high school classrooms. So how am I going to really support the learning of content and language during the time that they are out of the ELD instructional program? This is something that we need to actually tell people about, because people, sometimes schools, they think that ELD instruction actually done by the ESL teacher is the responsibility or has all the responsibility of educating this child. Actually, the children belong to all of us. I'm talking about English language development standards. They have to be implemented not only by the ESL teachers, but also by the content teachers, because children are developing language every time they are in classrooms. So we all need to understand that we are implementing the Pennsylvania English Language Development Standards. These standards can be found on the address that I have on the bottom. It is important that we have, that there are 5 standards, and one standard addresses the social instructional language. Then there's the language of language arts. Students develop not only can also communicate information, ideas, and concepts in the language of language arts. They can also communicate information, ideas, and concepts in the language of mathematics. And they communicate information, ideas, and concepts in the language of science. And the same way for the language of social studies. So that is important, that we really look at language development from the communication of information, ideas, and concepts. Another component, if you are putting together a program for English language learners, is that every teacher needs to have a copy of this document. This document is the WIDA performance definitions. There's 2 sides to this document. You're looking at the listening and reading. Those are the receptive skills. And for every level, there are descriptors that teachers need to understand. If you are a level 1, this is what you know and you're able to do in language development. So that means in English. Okay, so the 3 columns that you see are the ones that address linguistic complexity in green, then language forms and conventions in some sort of orange, and then in yellow, vocabulary usage. That's very important for all teachers to understand, because not all students that are ELs have the same level of understanding and communication in the language. You may have in your classroom students who could be level 4 and maybe one that is level 1. Well, they need different scaffolds according to their level of performance in language. This is important. I also have a website for you to find the document that you see here. This is the speaking and writing component, which is, the first one we looked at the listening and reading, receptive. Now speaking and writing. These are productive skills, the same kind of structure. The linguistic complexity, language forms and conventions, and vocabulary usage. Very important for all teachers to know. This is also very important for all teachers to know. Every year, the Pennsylvania Department of Education requires that all English learners who are in a language instruction educational program to take the Access for ELs 2.0 assessment. The assessment is implemented usually in the months of February and March, and then in the months of May and beginning of June, every LEA gets information about their students. One of the pieces of information that your district will receive, or your charter school will receive, is individual student report. In this report, what you see is the levels of listening, speaking, reading, and writing that your students have at the point when they were assessed. There's also There's also levels for oral language development, literacy, comprehension, and there's an overall score. So the first column that you see gives you the language domain. The second column is the proficiency levels. That's when you say, oh, this student is a 4.4 or a 5.6 in different areas. But the most important part is really the scale scores. That's how you can actually, look at the results and look for growth. That's one of the most important pieces of discussion when you are talking to teachers about your students. We also talk about WIDA resources. For all teachers and for your ESL teachers, WIDA provides us with many resources that we can use in order to scaffold our instruction. The WIDA can do descriptors are a set of tasks that have been classified by levels and also by domains, by listening, speaking, reading, and writing. These are documents that you can download for free if you go to this website, the address that you have there. The important thing for this is for your content teachers to really know what children know and are able to do, what they can do with language in listening, speaking, reading, and writing in the different levels of proficiency. That's very important for content teachers to know. Then we also see that in this is a one page that you can find in the can do descriptors. For example, this is for grade level cluster 3 to 5, grades 3 to 5. As you see the progression from each level, and when we look at level 4 and 5, we see that those are the ones that are at the highest levels of proficiency. And if you take a look at what they can do with reading and writing at those levels, it's very similar to what all of your students can do in your classroom. So that's where we see that transition of our students when they are in level 4 and 5, and especially the high 4s, that means 4.5, 6 and higher. They are students who actually need very little scaffold to be able to perform in your classrooms. Now, if you look at your level 1, you will see that they will require more specific instruction and more specific scaffolds. That's why you need to work hand in hand with your ESL teacher if you're a content teacher. That's why we need to work together in order to support these students in language development and in content attainment. We also have another set of can-do descriptors. They are called the key uses. This was a document that was created, I would say, 3 or 4 years ago. And this was created in order to really align our instruction with the standards that now are required for all children to achieve. So this is important because it really focuses on the 4 skills that are required, in all kinds of academic development. And it says there the type of language used most often in academic and business settings, and that is recount, explain, argue, and discuss. So how can we actually have children performing these tasks with language and with one another, in groups? And also, how can we move them from one level to the other by making them work together at performing these tasks? You can download these WIDA can do descriptors key uses at the address that you have on the bottom part of the standard. This is how they look like. This is for grade cluster 6 to 8 and in the skill set of recount for reading and writing. And if you take a look at the way that these skills are classified, you will see that, again, for levels 4, 5, and 6, That is where most of your students in the class in your classrooms are, regardless of whether they are ELs or not. These are really, tasks or skills that need to be developed by all students, including activities in which students have to use language to actually, for example, matching details of content related topics to main ideas. That is something that all students need to have, an opportunity to do. So that is why we really push very hard to look at these skill sets for all your students. And you see also that for level one, the tasks are a little different, but they are still recounting using many of the scaffolds necessary for them to get all the way up to be able to sequence, to be able to order, events and all of that. This is so important and it's a very exciting document. WIDA also has the speaking and writing rubrics that are necessary for all teachers to understand the process of developing this skill. You can find these rubrics, which are evidence-based, at the address that is on the bottom of the slide. The WIDA Speaking and Interpreter rubric has been developed looking at the three components that you see in the performance definitions: linguistic complexity, language forms, and vocabulary usage. So when we want to monitor progress of our ELs, it's very important to use these speaking and writing rubrics. More so if you're a content teacher, usually the ESL teacher will actually monitor that speaking component also, but the writing interpreted rubric is so important for you to understand where your student is and how that student is moving towards, a higher level. What can he do with writing in order to reach the proficient level in writing? One part of our chart addresses how can we ensure social integration and instructional integration of our students. English learners really need to be supported not only in the academic area but also in the social and the adjusting cross-cultural or acculturation process. So it's important that if you are going to create a program for them, you need to include how are you going to really support these students to have access to gifted programs. How are they going to participate in extracurricular activities? How are you going to actually provide them with the correct or the most effective way to be assessed for special education? What about vocational and technical schools? Are they getting all this information so parents understand that these children could have access to these programs? In many instances, parents are not giving this information, especially when these parents do not have a high level of proficiency in English. So we have to make sure that we're looking at those elements that are providing equal access to education for our students. We have to ensure that there are accommodations to support all levels of English language proficiency in all content areas. So not just the ESL teacher, but everybody needs to understand the different levels of English language development. How are you integrating your students with same age peers? Are you promoting social interaction with students who are from different backgrounds, and also with students, like for example in the cafeteria, in places like at recess time? Are they integrated with other students? Are you making it possible for them to participate in games so students start to really break in the barrier of not speaking or not having the same culture? Are you communicating also to staff and support staff? What are the needs of these children? Are you talking to the cafeteria workers, the bus drivers? How are you integrating these children, to that community in your schools? Are you communicating with parents in their preferred mode and language? That's very important. It is the responsibility of the school system to provide qualified interpreters. So we have to really look at that. The other section in your chart talks about the area of reassessing, reassess for exiting the language instruction educational program, or then how am I monitoring students to continue progressing, right? There is a specific multi-criteria for reclassification procedures that I will be addressing in a few minutes. Pennsylvania has its own exit criteria, and it also has its own way to plan for monitoring after students have exited the program. In Pennsylvania, we have 4 years to monitor students. 2 years are done formally, and the other 2 years are done in a way that you are providing information about, you are collecting information or evidence that the student is moving ahead, is not regressing, okay, or providing the scaffolds or the supports if the student is finding, a challenge in learning. This is the reclassification, monitoring and redesignation criteria for ELs. You can actually find this document at the address that is on the bottom. It's important for you to understand what is required for your students to exit the program. This is almost like a summary of what the reclassification procedures entitle. The reclassification criteria in Pennsylvania has 2 components. The first component is the Access Proficiency Level scores, and the second component is actually a language use inventory that entitles 2 kinds of rubrics. One rubric addresses interaction, listening, speaking, and reading, and the second rubric addresses writing cohesion, writing word phrases, writing grammar, sentences, writing genre, narrative, writing genre, report and essays, and writing genre arguments. Who implement these inventories? The inventories are implemented by the ESL teacher and a content teacher. All of the guidelines for this implementation and the rubrics are part of the document that you need to download. So students are exited once they reach the threshold for reclassification, which at the minimum has to be 10.5 points. All of these scores are translated into points that are added, and then the student needs to reach a minimum of 10.5 in order to be exited from the English Language Development Program. Another component that is also very important for all of us to know is that we have an English Language Proficiency Individual Student Growth Target. And that is, you can find the whole document here on the address that you have on the top. Actually, we are looking at growth from the perspective of the level of the student and the number of years the student has been in the program. So it is important that we understand how the Department of Education is asking us to really provide them with information of the growth that our students are making in English language proficiency year to year. So that's something that if you go to that address, there's more information about it, but there's also a webinar that you can access in order to have an explanation about how to read this chart. The last part is, how do we provide evidence of program effectiveness? Our programs need to be effective with our students. Otherwise, we are really wasting our time, resources, and we are not complying with ESSA. We're not complying with the Department of Education requirements. So we need to document. We need to have a way to inform staff, students, and parents in what am I expecting from my program. So there has to be some sort of a program guide, a handbook that I always say, your program needs to have a handbook in which you explain from day one what happens when the student is identified, what will happen in the program, how are you going to assess the student. All of that needs to be written down in some sort of a handbook to guide staff, students, and parents. You need to develop some sort of record keeping plan. How am I going to really collect this evidence of learning, and how am I going to share it with others? You need to appoint a team to implement program evaluation. It is a requirement of the law to evaluate your program every year. And one way to evaluate your program is through your students' results. And you need to schedule how this team is going, or when this team is going to really look at your program and um, report on your growth, on the growth or the achievements of your program to parents and to other school leaders. Now we move into family and community engagement. If there is a component that ESSA is emphasizing through Title III and Title I, is that family and community engagement. Why is it important? Because research after research has proven that when families and community are part of the equation of student progress, we get very good and positive results. And when we do not include our communities and families, then what we have is environments where there's no equity. So equity actually requires that family and community engagement. What are required then? There has to be, an annual parent notification. And that means that our EL parents also need to get information about your English language development program, about your language instruction educational program at the beginning of the school year in the language that they understand. Okay, so it is, there's even a 30 days of the start of the school year once the student has been evaluated. It is important that you also talk about the benefits of the student participating in this language instruction educational program, and that how beneficial it is going to be not only for the academics and the language, but also for the social integration. You also need to notify them about the right to refuse services as outlined in this document. A description of any Title III supplemental services being offered by the school if applicable. In some instances, some funding from Title III is used for after-school programs, for Saturday programs, and for summer programs. They need to know about that. They also need to know that they can refuse Title III supplemental services. That means that if they don't want their child to participate in a Saturday program, they can actually refuse that. For culturally and linguistically diverse families, please consider that you as a district, you as a program, need to actually use different modes of communication with these families, and in what language is their preferred language. You need to scaffold to remove language and cultural barriers, become more visual, use charts, pictures rather than a lot of words, because sometimes parents will interpret that better than having 3 or 4 paragraphs. And that is not only for culturally and linguistically diverse parents, that could be for parents who actually have not developed a high level of literacy, or for whom, the preferred mode of communication is not the written word. If you're going to choose sites for meetings and times based on the family needs, please make sure that you know your families. In many instances, if we are going to have a meeting at a place that it requires for them to use public transportation or a car, be aware that in some cities or small communities, buses do not run, until late. So how are they going to really get there? Advertisement of your meetings and your events in school is very important. You need to use, there's different ways now to communicate with parents. There are radio stations that are offered in the language of the community, in multiple languages to say. When I was in Philadelphia, I directed the ESL and bilingual program there, and we always connected with radio stations that will advertise in Spanish or Chinese or Khmer or any other language. We also use newspapers that are, left in the bodegas or in the small stores. These newspapers are free, and so we will advertise there. We made a network with the local churches, and we talked to the pastors and the priests and anybody from the different local churches, and we advertised, like, for example, kindergarten registration and other things that were very important for our parents. I saw many principals communicating with parents during dismissal time to communicate about, important news about the school. It's a very good way to socialize also with the parents in a more casual way. Not only to access but also to consider it part of our trainings, and being able to provide teachers with the tools that they need in order to close that gap of the communication gap with parents. In this slide, you're going to find many translated forms and documents. Now, if you're going to use um, this slide to communicate with other teachers, actually, you can find many forms that are important for all of them. So even the English Learner Program exit letter, there's a parent-teacher conference notices that you can send home. So if you click on folder number 12 and you open it, you will find all of these documents translated in multiple languages, not only in Spanish but in multiple languages. For any question regarding policy, regarding all the information that I have provided in this webinar, please contact the PDE ESL and Bilingual Education Advisor, Robert Miso, and that is his address. Anything related to policy, anything related to assessment, anything related to access to WIDA, we are part of the WIDA consortium. So if you want to start a program, you need to contact Mr. Miso, because he will be the one that will provide you with more information about policy. The resources that I have are documents that I have cited in the different slides that you have seen. I will advise you to go over the resources. I have also added some good information about the Office of English Language Acquisition, OELA, with the toolkit. Sometimes we need ammunition. Sometimes we need to help our leadership understand the rights of these children. So the Office for Civil Rights is an excellent resource to enlighten leadership about the necessities of these children. So there is the PD Basic Education, Educating English Learners. You can access that document. Address is there. For WIDA resources, I have put all of that here for you to use as part of your program development.